So for today's video, as you can see by the title, the topic is UFC fighters that were pushed too quickly, and that resulting in their careers taking a very bad hit or their careers just ending as a whole. And the inspiration for this video was what happened last weekend with Tai Tuivasa, because I think he is a victim of this. I think he was someone that was pushed too quick. So let's just get into him. Let's just start with him first, since I already mentioned him. So let's go.
So looking at Ty's record and fights, his is a little bit different because if you go way back to 2018, 2019, he actually had 3 losses in a row to some pretty good guys. So he went on a little 5-fight winning streak here against some, lower ranked guys. And then he fought Junior Dos Santos. This was back in 2018. Lost. Then he fought Blagoy Ivanov, lost, and then he fought Sergey Spivak, and then he lost. So it's funny because these 3 guys are guys now that are like pretty high up in the UFC rankings, but at this time they were low, so they didn't really know how good they were. And so this is a bit of like foreshadowing going on because we didn't know how the skill level of these guys at the time. Besides Junior, we know he's good, but the other 2, they were just young guys like how Ty was. But yeah, the point is we didn't know at the time. So after that, he went on a big win streak. Went against Stefan Struve, who was way past his prime. Harry Hunsucker, who's not very good. Greg Hardy, who we know isn't very good. He probably should have never been in the UFC. And then Augusto Sakai and Derek Lewis. Now, Lewis is good, but he also has a lot of questionable losses. We know how he can be. So he goes on that 5-fight win streak against not-so-good guys. And then after the Derek Lewis fight, he gets thrown into a fight against Cyril Gane right away. Now, that's obviously a huge step up. Like, Cyril Gane is top of the top. And then, it's not over. Fights Sergey Pavlovich next. Now, the run Sergey was going on before he lost to Tom was crazy. And then he lost that a minute into the first round. And then Alexander Volkov. Anyone who has some ground game is probably going to beat Tai Tuivasa, as we learned last weekend. And speaking of that, after that, he fought Tybura, and he was doing well, and then he got choked out.
And this is one that the UFC probably should have saw coming. To throw him into that Cyril Gane fight right after the Derek Lewis fight is just not smart. You have a guy like Derek Lewis who's just kind of a big power puncher, who he's either going to knock you out or you're going to get knocked out. Ty just so happened to knock him out. And then throw him into a fight against Gane, who's just this crazy, skillful striker at heavyweight. Probably one of the most skilled technical strikers at heavyweight. Just wasn't a good move for the UFC. And again, they should have known this from his previous 3 losses in his early part of his career. This always happens with guys who the UFC thinks could be a potential star. And that was definitely the case with Ty. He's this funny, kind of fat guy, Australian, just a good guy to market, and that's what they saw in him. He did have that moment against Gane, but after that loss, that's another thing. After a fighter gets knocked out like that, a lot of the times they're just never really the same. We've seen it time and time again, and that's another thing that happened with Ty. It wasn't just a skill difference, it was him taking so much damage, and then he can't take as much after the next fight, the next fight, the next fight. So yeah, that's what happened with him. This is pretty much what happens with all these guys. They get on a winning streak against pretty low-level competition for the most part. At least not top of the top. Maybe guys that are unranked or just inside the top 15. They go on a big winning streak like Ty did, and then the UFC sees them as a potential star. And so you could either do one of 2 things. You can kind of do what they did with Sean O'Malley and build him kind of slow. I know they threw him in to the deep end with Peter Yan eventually, but before that, they were going really slow with him. As we saw, it worked out. He became champion, and now he defended his belt. So I think that's a way smarter approach, but they also see it as a risk because they could end up losing to one of those guys. You never know. Anything can happen. And then where do you go from there? It makes it even harder. So yeah, a lot of the times they throw them right into the deep end. If they lose, you can kind of keep them at the top because you can say they lost to a top guy, so they can kind of stay up there. But if they're not on that skill level and they're in that top echelon and they don't fit in, they're probably just going to keep losing. And it's going to be even worse for their career in the long run. And that's what happened with Ty. Threw him against Gane, lost that. Pavlovich lost that. And now he's kind of in this weird spot where it's like the UFC wanted him to be a star. He already lost to so many of the top guys. So it's like, what do you do with him now? And now it's like 4 in a row. So when it gets that bad, it's like then you're on the verge of retirement or getting cut. I'm not saying it's fully the UFC's fault. I mean, it's Ty's the one who wants to win these fights, but in the way the UFC played a part in ruining a potential star's career, and now they don't have that star. So that's what happens. And yeah, he's pretty much even in the UFC. He's 8-7 now. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, these guys that have a personality and the UFC likes them, they kind of get more privilege than a guy who doesn't. Like, when a guy starts getting to a losing UFC record, it's likely they're going to get cut. But with these star guys, they kind of like to keep them around and have these fun fights still. But when it comes to being at the top and potentially becoming champ, it kind of ends for them when that happens. So
the next person I want to talk about is probably the most infamous version of this scenario happening, and that's Darren Till. Everybody knows this one. Firstly, I'm just going to read off some of these names of the guys who he fought. And I'm not even going to go over the names before the UFC because we know that most of those guys aren't the best. And that's just who you have to fight to get there. And by the way, I'm not trying to insult these people who they fight on the come up, but I'm just pointing these out because all these people I'm going over in my mind had potential to get to the top. So that's why I'm saying all this. But anyways, let me read off some of these names from his UFC debut onward. So his UFC debut is against Wendell de Oliveira Marquez. I just checked his record. He's 40 years old now, and he's gone 31-16. That's his record as of today. And he hasn't done very well after the fight against Darren, but he's not a terrible fighter, and that's not a bad debut. Next one is Nicholas Dalby. Now, we all know him, very good fighter, but he went to a draw with Darren, so he didn't even win. That just shows how good they both were at the time. And yeah, so he's gone 24-3. 24-3, Dalby is. And he's still in the UFC, he's still winning, so good fighter. Went to a draw with him. Next one is Jesse Ayari, or Jessen Ayari. That's the fight. After that, Darren won by decision. Jessen is pretty terrible. I checked his record, he's pretty bad. Next one is Bohan Velikovic, however you say that name. Decent fighter, but just like all the other guys besides Dalby, none of them are in the UFC anymore. Pretty much after they lost to Darren, they were gone, and they haven't been able to get back. So if they're not UFC caliber guys, they're not very close to the top. So now after that one, though, we have Donald Cerrone, and that's a pretty big step up from these other guys, but keep in mind, this is not prime Donald Cerrone at all. I love Donald, but near the end of his career, he was definitely used as a stepping stone for a lot of these young fighters. But still a decent win, but not a prime guy who's near the top. He was one of those guys that, he's getting older, but he's still kind of holding his ranking. Maybe he's 50-50 at this point. So one of those guys that can easily be used as a stepping stone, which he was. So after that, a very close decision against Wonderboy. Now, this was his first win over a prime top contender, in my opinion, but he barely won it. It arguably could have went to Wonderboy. And then he gets a title shot off that against Tyron Woodley, who was a beast at the time. Remember how good Woodley was back then? I remember it was supposed to be Colby versus Woodley at the time, but something was going on with the negotiations, or one side didn't want to do it. Something was going on. The UFC didn't like Colby at the time either, so because of that, they saw the opportunity to give the shot to Darren. I think it was a horrible move on the UFC's part. Darren did not develop his skills enough to beat Woodley at all. I think they should have given him 1 or 2 more fights against other top contenders, and even if he lost, he would still gain experience and develop his skills. After the Woodley loss, he fought Masvidal, and I think the UFC thought that would be an easy win for Till. But in my opinion, he just didn't fight smart. He could have definitely won it, but he was just trying to be crazy and having fun in there and got knocked out because of it. And that loss probably played more of a factor in his career going downhill than the Woodley fight. And after that, he just moved weight classes. I don't think it was a bad move because he was kind of killing himself to get down to welterweight. So probably not a bad move. He made his debut at middleweight against Kelvin Gastelum. He won a split decision, which was very close, and
Again, he arguably could have lost that. Wins that, and then after that he fights Whitaker. And he lost that by decision, but that was also a close fight. He was close to winning that as well, which would have been a huge win against a guy like Whitaker. And those two fights weren't bad. Even though he lost one of them, he was still getting his career back on track. He was looking good. But then the next two fights are the most frustrating thing about Till's career. His wrestling and submission defense. Like I was saying earlier, he's very one-dimensional. All he can do is strike. Just can't defend against wrestling at all, gets submitted, taps really quick. It's just super frustrating to watch because he has so much potential and he has these glaring holes in his game clearly. But yeah, I just think his career could have went way different if they pushed him in a different direction and not pushed him so hard and quick right away because they wanted him to be a star. He had more of a chance to develop his game. I mean, that's on him that he didn't, but it's also on the matchups. The Brunson fight and the Duplessis fight are just the nail in the coffin, though. I think he could have easily won both of those if he just developed some skills on the ground and was able to defend takedowns. I mean, that Dricus fight was terrible. He just flopped to his back as soon as he got his legs grabbed. But yeah, that's pretty much the story of Till's career. It's a sad one. I think he had a lot of potential, but who knows if he really could have won the belt. But I'm saying if he developed, I think he could because his striking was great. His Muay Thai, he had, I think, over 100 Muay Thai fights, so his striking was great, but yeah, just need to develop that ground game. But yeah, that's the story of Till. The next two we're going to group together, and that's Paige VanZant and Sage Northcutt. And the reason why I'm going to group them together is because they came in the UFC around the same time, and it was pretty much the same situation, just different genders. They were both these good-looking, supposedly very skilled fighters, and both didn't have that much experience before the UFC. So first, looking at Paige, let's look at what earned her a chance in the UFC. So she had these 4 fights before the UFC against 3 women that I have no idea who they are. Maybe I'm just a casual, but I mean, does anyone know who these people are besides Tisha Torres? And she lost that fight. Split decision against Jordan Nicole Gaza. No idea who that is. Don't know Amber. Don't know Courtney. So that's what earned her a UFC contract. That's all. I think she might have had some amateur fights before that too, but not many. She was just pushed very quickly by the people around her in the UFC. So yeah, anyway, those 4 fights got her UFC contract. First fight, she gets a TKO, big win, then a decision, then a submission. And then she fights Rose, which, as we know today, this was back in 2015, but huge step up. I mean, main event, 3 fights into her contract, she gets a main event on a fight night against, obviously, a good fighter in Rose. But yeah, loses that by submission. Then she takes a step back, fights Beck Rowlings. Don't really know who that is. Sounds kind of familiar. Gets a KO, so another big win. And then here's the problem again. She gets thrown in against another very good fighter. Michelle Waters gets submitted in the first round. Jessica Rose Clark loses that. As we know, she's a good fighter. Fights Rachel Ostovich, and she wins that. Rachel's not in the UFC anymore. She was never really a good fighter. And then her last fight in the UFC was Amanda Ribas, who, again, is a really good fighter. And, yeah, she lost that, and she was out of the UFC. Hasn't fought since then. Or maybe she's fought in another promotion. I don't know, but I think she's doing OnlyFans or something now. So, good for her, I guess. Yeah, that was kind of the theme of her career. Just, she gets a win, gets a step up, loses, step back down, wins, step up again, loses. So yeah, she could only really win against the low level. So she just couldn't really cut it in the UFC. I mean, I probably pin this more on... I mean, she was skilled, though, because she was able to win against UFC competition, just not the top. I just think she was pushed way too quick. If she actually developed her skills, I think she could have been great, because she had a good base. But she was just so young at the time. Like, she's only 29 years old today. So back then, like, she was, in her very early 20s, fighting in the UFC. Like, it's crazy. Almost 10 years ago. Like, she would have been 19, 20 years old. Yeah, just pushed way too quick. She had a lot of potential. So, yeah, that one sucks. She definitely could have been a huge star just with her looks alone. So, yeah, that's what happened with her. Now, with Sage, like I said, it's kind of the same story. This good-looking guy with chiseled abs, super skilled striker, potential to be a huge star. Now, his come-up before the UFC is a little different. He had a little bit more experience than Paige, but he had 5 professional fights before getting into the UFC. And they were all finishes, like TKO, 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 submission, submission. And then he got his debut. He got a TKO in that.
submission in his next fight. And then here's the big step up. 2 fights into the UFC. Brian Barberena in 2016. Barberena was good at this time. He was really good. Big step up, loses by submission, takes a step back down, wins a decision. Fights Mickey Gall, who he seems to be the star killer. I mean, he's the one that beat CM Punk as well. So yeah, Mickey was pretty good. He wasn't top of the top, that's for sure, but again, submitted him, kind of killed his momentum for sure. And then he did get 3 UFC wins after that against not very good guys, but it's not like he ended on a bad note with the UFC. But after that, he just didn't want to re-sign. He went to one championship, wanted more money, and then he got KO'd in that, and he won his last fight, so that's good for him. But yeah, his momentum took a huge hit, obviously, with his UFC run, losing those 2 big fights. So he definitely had a lot of potential. He still does. He's still only 28 years old, so I think he can definitely still be something. But I think he could have been something in the UFC. Again with Page, though, he's just so young at this time. He's 18, 19, 20 years old. So young to be in the UFC. I understand, like, the UFC wants to grab these stars early, but the good thing about the UFC is they don't really have to worry about that because they're always kind of the top premier organization that most of the time people want to be in. So you can let these guys develop and gain their skills and then grab them. I think grabbing them when they're 18 years old isn't really smart, but I mean, who knows? Who knows? It can pan out better than that. So yeah, anyways, pretty similar situation with what happened with these 2. All of the story is take it a little slow. I think that's the smarter move. We saw that with O'Malley, worked out for him, he became champ. Just give them these big guys when you really think they're ready. Don't take this big risk, you know what I mean? So there's so many fighters on the UFC roster. You can match them up with anyone. You don't have to go right to the top right away. But yeah, I thought this was interesting. This seems to happen quite a bit with these guys that are potential stars. Yeah, I don't think it works out most of the time. There's probably a few instances where it does, and I can maybe go over that in another video. But yeah, those are 4 people who I believe were pushed too quick, and I think their career could have been way different. But who knows? We can only speculate. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching.